Several years ago, I don't know if you remember, but I remember there being a lot of discussion about random acts of kindness. Random acts of kindness. I remember seeing a poster once with 100 random acts of kindness on it. And I don't know if you know this, but there's even a Random Acts of Kindness Day. And it's observed on February 17th. One of the descriptors for Random Acts of Kindness Day is that it is a favorite day for many, as people everywhere are enjoying doing these acts of kindness. February 17th. Look forward to it. Put it on your calendar. Isn't it great that we have one day to be kind? Fantastic. But as I was preparing for this sermon, someone asked an interesting question. Are acts of kindness ever random? Are acts of kindness ever random, she asked. Great question. Now, I'm not trying to be a Scrooge, but that phrase, random acts of kindness, has always bugged me. While we may encounter random opportunities to be kind, I don't think that the act of being kind is random. Being kind is intentional. Doing kind things for others, or even for ourselves, always involves a decision. Today we explore the motivation for kindness, especially from our Christian perspective. Is it really random? Now, it's funny that we're talking about kindness on the day when we hear from the seemingly unfriendly, grumpy John the Baptist. Now, last week we heard a little bit about John the Baptist's story. We heard about Zechariah. We heard about how he was without speech for the entirety of the time when John the Baptist was in the womb. There was silence. But evidently John is making up for Zechariah's silence, because he is not holding back. John is crying out from the wilderness, quoting the prophet Isaiah we heard last week. Make the rough places plain, make the crooked places straight. And today his conversation continues. The scene is this. There are crowds. There are crowds of people who have come to John the Baptizer to be baptized. Now, some of you may have experienced this at St. Paul's. When we have baptisms, we have a nice rehearsal. Gwen works with the couples or the people being baptized to make sure they're prepared, that they know what's going on, that they feel comfortable. But not John. John shouts at his baptismal candidates, "You brood of vipers!" He calls them snakes. That was an insult. I mean, I can't say what it was, but he calls them snakes, and then John seems to attack their lineage. He seems to attack their lineage, but he doesn't. He is not ruling anyone out. In fact, what John is doing is quite radical. Remember that the people in the crowds would have probably taken a great amount of pride in being from the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So John is telling them that that status doesn't really matter. That status does not set them apart as extraordinary. It's kind of like church members who say, "I've been a member of this church all of my life," expecting some sort of privileged treatment. No, John is telling these crowds And the crowds are made up of Gentiles and Jew and disciples and curious onlookers. John is saying we're all in this together. No matter who you are, God does not check membership. So the crowds are understandably thrown off by John's idea that ancestry doesn't count for much, because they've probably checked it out through Ancestry.com, and they have proof that they are children of Abraham. And then the interesting question comes. And this is the question I want to unpack with you today, around which I build this sermon. After John says, hey, that doesn't matter, I can imagine them throwing their hands up and saying, oh, what do we do now? What do we do now? That question is repeated several times in our gospel. And when things are repeated, we're called to pay attention. And this is where something really interesting happens. You'd think that with this setup from the unkind, unfriendly, grumpy John the Baptist, that he would be prepared to rattle off some long, complicated set of instructions about salvation. But he doesn't. He does something extraordinary. And before we explore that, I want to just chat with you a little bit about who are the people who ask that question, what do we do now? There are three categories in here. The first one are the crowds. The crowds, what do we do now? Now, the crowds would have known about the garment that Jesus mentions. It would have been a very common garment to have. It says coat in your translation, but a better, more accurate translation, it's garment. And that would have been a garment that was worn close to the body. And they would have had two of those garments, one for everyday life and one reserved for the Sabbath. And then the second category of person is the soldiers. They were mercenaries. They were under the rule of Herod or the Roman procurator. And their role was similar to toll collectors. And they were hated by the population. And then the other category is tax collectors. They were known to be a part of a corrupt system in which they took as much as possible. So with that in mind, let's hear again what John says in response to the questions. What do we do now? What do we do now? Says the crowd. And John says, whoever has two coats must share one with anyone who has none. And whoever has food must do likewise. And then the tax collectors, what do we do now? And John says to the tax collectors, collect no more than the amount prescribed for you. And then the soldiers, what do we do now? And John says, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusations, and be satisfied with your wages. One scholar says that all three of these answers call for an end to a lifestyle based on greed and the accumulation of material possessions. Or as another preacher puts it more simply, share, be fair, don't bully. Share, be fair, don't bully. So when John talks about these fruits worthy of repentance, this is what he's talking about. Care for and concern for our neighbor. Being intentional about what we have and about what we share. Being intentional about noticing what others have and do not have. The kind of kindness that John is suggesting is not random. It is intentional. Some would even call it a mindful approach. mindful. This is why repentance or change of mind is so important to John the Baptizer and to Luke. It's because repentance means that we've made the decision. We've made the decision to live our life in a way that is more kind and fair and equitable. The way we live flows from repentance, and it shapes the life that we live and the life that we hope others will live. Share, be fair, don't bully. Your intention to give, our intention to give to the church or to our neighbor is rarely random. It involves thought and prayer and even sacrifice. And St. Paul's, I see you. You are kind and generous people. I see what you do. I know your acts of kindness, going out of your way to shop for others, going out of your way to cook for others, going out of your way to put a sum of your own treasure on the blank line of a pledge card. These are not random acts. The decision to pray for someone who has wronged you, the decision to live more simply, the decision to recycle or remember your reusable bags, or when I forget mine, Matthew makes me go back and get them. Sacrifice, putting the needs of others first, teaching, singing, visits, offering your skills to those who need them. These sorts of things are never random. They are born out of God. And they are born out of God's love for you and from God's call to live our lives in a specific way of love. So today we learn so much from this passage. Today, grumpy, blustery John the Baptist calls us to simple truths of how to live. And notice that he does not call us to religious things. Going to church, reading the Bible, praying. Now, do all those things. But what John the Baptist is calling forth from these everyday people is things that they do every day with everyday people in their everyday lives. He's calling them to use those things in extraordinary ways. Share, be fair, don't bully. What do we do now? This sermon centers around this question because it's one I feel we have all asked. What do we do now? Where do we go from here? Who are we to be? We've tried so many things. What now? Well, first, that question suggests an openness. It suggests a receptivity and a willingness to be in conversation, and maybe even do things in a new way. And then the question also leads us, as one preacher says, to think about this. What would it look like if we went out from this church today looking for opportunities to be honest, kind, and fair? In a culture that is impatient, immature, and fearful, what if we believed and acted on the belief that being honest, kind, and fair really makes a difference? What if we believed that way and lived that way, the way? How would that change us and the world? It's our call to find out. And it won't happen randomly. It will only happen with intentional, extraordinary acts of grace and probably acts of bravery that have been planted in our hearts and hands by Jesus the Christ. And then think about it, finally, as we prepare for the season that is ahead, the weeks that are ahead, the starry nights, the journey of Mary. the angels visiting shepherds. Jesus did not come randomly out of nowhere. Jesus did not come randomly out of nowhere. Jesus came intentionally out of the heartbeat of God to bring heaven closer and to bring the kingdom into reality. So, on this Sunday, where we lift up the word rejoice, gaudete, we rejoice that Jesus came to put love and grace and forgiveness into our hands. So let us rejoice in these gifts that are ours to give away. May it be so.